Thank you all so much for coming. Sorry to interrupt the conversation. I'm glad people are enjoying food. My name is Chesa Boudin. I'm the Executive Director of Berkeley Law School's Criminal Law and Justice Center. Many of you I know, and some of you I work with, and others I'm excited to hear from and get to know. But what brings us together today is that we have the tremendous privilege of having Mari Narváez with us, all the way from Puerto Rico, to talk about her work and some of the issues in Puerto Rico and beyond involving police accountability, data analysis, human rights, and also thinking more broadly about alternatives to policing. She's someone I've had the privilege of getting to know and calling a friend over the last year, and it's really, for me, tremendously exciting to get to welcome her to the space that I call home, to get to hear about the work that she does, and hopefully to draw on and learn from all of the amazing work that she's done. I will just say, at the risk of it being a spoiler, that one of the things I'm hopeful she'll tell us a little bit about today is the ways in which her organization has partnered with law schools and law clinics, as well as with data analysis groups, through really interdisciplinary collaborations to achieve some of the goals that they're fighting for, and that I know many of us in our own work, just looking around the room, also have in our local communities. So with that, I'm going to pass the proverbial microphone to Mari. I'm going to apologize to her that not all of us speak Spanish, and therefore we're going to ask her to speak to us in English. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. I'm going to speak English, and my English is very creative, so you'll see that along the way. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here, especially accompanying my friend Chesa Boudin, who I think I met too late in life, maybe, but we have so many things in common, and I'm very grateful to have met him recently and to be here today. I am a law school dropout. I have to say that from the beginning. So the good part of that is that I'm always looking for, for defenders to join our cause and just to be able to have people around that can take me out of, difficult situations. And that's what most lawyers do. So I'm really glad to see if I can, recruit some new allies from UC Berkeley today. So especially, I say that joking, but I know that most of you are or will be people that will be working to disarticulate the systems of oppression that our societies confront every day. And that is important for, not only for all of our causes in police accountability, but also for our colonial situation in Puerto Rico. We need American allies or people from the United States that stand with us in our centurion cause of anti-colonialism in Puerto Rico. So, I don't know, Puerto Rico, it's an island in the Caribbean, and it doesn't have self-government, but culturally, we consider ourselves a nation because we have a distinct culture, history, language, and I don't say this lightly. Since the U.S. invaded our country in 1898, we've had to, we've been imposed of American culture, and the English language particularly has been imposed in Puerto Rico in innumerable ways, and the Puerto Rican people have resisted that for many, many years and decades. Just to tell you a little story so that you can interpret, my father in the 1930s, when he went to public school, he had to speak English. I mean, that was the mandate was to speak English for both teachers and students. But of course, not even the teachers they could barely speak any English. So what they did was they shut the doors from the classrooms and they would speak Spanish, but if a supervisor would come along, then everybody knew that they had to start, mumbling in English. And then when I went to school in the, I don't know, much later than the 1930s, of course. My dad was very old when he had me. When I finally went to school, we had already resisted that. Our country had already resisted the English imposition, so the classes were not taught in English. They were taught in Spanish, but still, we had to pledge allegiance every day to the American flag. And, you know, most of us didn't understand why we had to pledge allegiance to a country that was not ours. I mean, it was a memorable country and everything, but it wasn't our country, because we were very, very clear that we were Puerto Ricans. And if you have had the experience in the United States, you know that there are communities that are Cuban Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, African Americans, I mean, Chinese Americans, but you've never heard of a Puerto Rican American. That's like something that doesn't happen, because even Puerto Ricans who wish to be a part of the United States and not a possession of the United States, which is what we are right now, even those Puerto Ricans consider themselves Puerto Ricans, not Americans, you know? So that is, the language has been very important in our resistance, in our colonial resistance in Puerto Rico. So we were imposed an American citizenship unilaterally, but not because we didn't have a Puerto Rican citizenship, which we did and we do, and I could speak about that some other day. We were imposed, I always say, we are not American citizens. We are colonial subjects with an American passport, which is different. But that was because the U.S. could use the cheap labor of our mostly brown and black people to draft us to their wars. So it was not a gift that they gave us or anything, or it was not the intention was not either to give us certain rights, you know. And we have been, through history, robbed of our lands. We have been robbed of our lands for military purposes. We have been guinea pigs for scientific and military experiments, from the use of napalm and other chemical weapons to decades of military live ammunition practices around the civil population of Vieques Island. We are also Monsanto's biggest transgenic experimentation land off the continent, and we have lost more than half of our population because of migration, because our economy has never been developed for Puerto Ricans. It has always served other purposes. So there are 5 million Puerto Ricans outside of the island, or the archipelago, because we are a group of islands in Puerto Rico, and 3.2 live in our island, in our archipelago. Most recently, our country has been transformed into a tax paradise for the American rich. So this has caused an unprecedented move of rich Americans, and of course, that has displaced many people from different communities, because the real estate has changed dramatically since that happened. So Puerto Ricans are now having lots of difficulty buying land or properties. Sometimes they just can't do it, because it's ridiculous how expensive it is now to buy properties there. So I wanted to tell you that, I have my presentation here, let me. I want to tell you a little bit about the story of Kilómetro Cero. Of course, part of this situation with our colonial situation is that our freedom fighters and anti-colonialist leaders have been brutally repressed by the United States since its invasion. The police in Puerto Rico was created actually to confront political resistance in Puerto Rico. That's what's the reason of being. And anyone who stood for any cause, even if it was an environmental cause, was persecuted by both the federal government and the police in Puerto Rico. In the FBI's infamous COINTELPRO, a counterintelligence program conducted by the FBI, aiming at surveilling and infiltrating, discrediting and disrupting political organizations. My father was a pro-independence leader in Puerto Rico. He has the biggest archive in Puerto Rico of COINTELPRO and the police developing files just because of your ideology, just because he fought for independence, you know? So in that process, not only were revolutionaries or just people that protested, environmentalists, feminists, anyone who stood for a cause was filed by both the FBI and the local police in Puerto Rico. And also, most revolutionaries in Puerto Rico, historically, hundreds of them have been political prisoners in prisons, both in Puerto Rico and in the United States. And in that process, they have also been killed. Some of our revolutionaries have been killed, but I want to talk about the latest one. It was in 2005. When a huge contingent of the FBI arrived in Puerto Rico, shot Filiberto Ojeda Rios, the leader of the Macheteros group, and then let him bleed to death in his house instead of arresting him. Filiberto Ojeda Rios was a larger-than-life character in Puerto Rico. I was little when my parents talked to me about him. He claimed his international right to use armed struggle to defend his right to autodetermination and independence in a colonial state. And when he returned to Puerto Rico from prison with an electronic ankle bracelet, I think you call it like that, right? Because his trial had been delayed, I met him through my dad. He impacted me greatly. I think I've never made this story publicly, but I was greatly impacted by his mere presence. That has never happened to me. I was like 10 years old and I just started crying when they introduced me to him because I was so moved by his presence. Of course, I was learning back then what all this meant, what colonialism meant. It's not something that you experience or live every day because life seems normal, you know? So you have to meet these people in order to, and know what is happening when you're little in order to begin creating a conscience. So 15 years later, I am an adult. We're all returning from commemorating this Cry of Lares, the first major rebellion of independence against Spanish rule in Puerto Rico, and the FBI and the Puerto Rico police surrounded Filiberto's house. We all went to protest that day in front of the federal court. He was killed that same day. He was left to bleed to death from a single shot on his lung. The FBI didn't give him first aid. They knew he was wounded and only entered his house the day after. So when he was killed, it was obvious that something very deep happened in our country. Most people in Puerto Rico do not support independence, but admire those who do. He was broadly seen as a noble, brave, and very consistent man that always was faithful and absolutely dedicated to Puerto Rico. So I know that I was changed that day, greatly changed that day. And even though I had been brought up in a house of freedom fighters, that day I finally learned what this was about. Like having seen an army of FBI agents arrive at the island, surround a house, kill a man, then pick up their things and leave like mercenaries without an explanation to local authorities, even when the state police was establishing their perimeter. That day I learned what colonialism was in practice, with my eyes. So I was furious and I was sad and I was disheartened like everybody else, lots of people. His funeral was the biggest funeral in Puerto Rican history. I didn't know what to do. I had terrible thoughts. I was even drawn to do something violent. But, I had never held a gun in my hands or anything. I wouldn't know what to do other than throw a few stones somewhere. Like I was going to I was going to be ridiculous if I did something wild, because that was not my thing. So I was a writer. I held a few different spaces in mainstream media and in alternative media, so I started writing. And I wrote and I wrote, and I discredited the FBI, and I insulted them, and I denounced, like many other people. I was not the only one. And I began even to question, like in an experimental exercise, how we were going to retaliate Filiberto's killing. I was wondering that. I was asking how collectively we were going to do that. So I believe that's why almost 10 years later, I became somehow obsessed with this issue of state violence. And I ended up founding this organization, Kilómetro Cero. I began to document police use of force killings in Puerto Rico, to gather data in what is known as a non-recording state. A non-recording state is a state where the state doesn't count the things that they need to count because they don't have the minimum will to be accountable. And in the United States, that also happens. There is no federal account of how many people the police kills, for example. There is no official data about that, but there is data on how many sharks attack people every year, and there's data on how many pigs there are in farms in the United States. And Puerto Rico is even worse. In Puerto Rico, nobody was counting this. We didn't know who was being killed by the police, and I wanted to know because I knew that had to be happening. So I started using my strategies as a journalist, doing some information solicitations, and I use all sorts of strategies. I hope they're all legal. I don't know. And I began gathering some data. I used, people's other institutions' help. I would recruit other groups. I would compare information. I did lots of things. So finally, I came to a point where I was able to create this organization 5 years ago, Kilómetro Cero. It was in a situation very distinct because we are under the Promesa Act since 2016. You might be interested in the fact that Promesa is the imposition of the Congress of the United States to our fiscal situation, a great public debt that Puerto Rico has, and that the United States permitted along the way. And they made sure that we need to pay our bondholders and vulture funds for that public debt that is unaudited, and it's a great debt, it's unpayable. But they imposed the junta of the Fiscal Control Board, and the Fiscal Control Board has veto power in Puerto Rico. They can veto any law, and they have absolute control of our budget. So that means that civil judicial claims against the state have been suspended ever since, because any promesa protects the state against plaintiffs who seek financial compensation. So if you have been killed by a police in a use of excessive force, we just stopped suing the government because your case would just be suspended for years. We have cases that have been suspended since 2017. And we are just beginning now to be able to sue the government again, now this year. So it's how many years later? Like 6 years later. So austerity measures have been imposed, of course, but you know who has not received austerity measures? The police in Puerto Rico. The police in Puerto Rico received an increase since the arrival of the Junta de Control Fiscal of 26% of their budget, while the University of Puerto Rico, which is a historic university, a public university that was very accessible and that made democratization of education available for everybody, has been defunded, greatly defunded. Only 36% less, only from the general fund. They have received other cuts. So austerity measures are not for everyone. Austerity measures are very targeted for certain groups and certain services that are essential in Puerto Rico, but not for the police. That's an analysis that we made. In Puerto Rico also, we have the same problem than here. It was not easy for us to do this analysis, but we recently were able to do a racial analysis, and it is in Puerto Rico. If you live in a mixed neighborhood, in a racially mixed neighborhood, you are 118% higher risk of being killed by the police than if you live in a neighborhood that is exclusively white. So that is very similar to what happens here. If you happen to, for example, if you happen to be a Marxist, for example, you might believe that economic circumstances or class was going to be an element of importance in that analysis, but we realized by doing this analysis that the element that is quite
controlling?
that is the main element in this analysis is the racial one, not the class one. So, for example, this case of Janet is a 23-year-old black mother who died in prison last year. She was a mental health patient. She was denied clinical attention. She was abused both by the police, by correctional guards, by inmates. The state says she committed suicide, and the inmates say that she was killed by the correctional guards. But this is just an example, and we know that it is not a coincidence that Janet is a black girl, a black single mother, a mental health patient. She has all the vulnerabilities that bring people to prison in both Puerto Rico and in the United States. She was also, she lived in a public housing project. Her family had to migrate to the United States, like more than half of Puerto Ricans. So she is a symbol of the terrible circumstances, the racist, misogynist, colonial, and patriarchal circumstances that are driving people to prisons and to be arrested by the police in Puerto Rico, just like it happens here. So I want to talk a little bit just about the strategies that we use in Kilómetro Cero. This is part of our analysis work, which is how we started doing data gathering and analysis. We do different types of data collection and analysis. We collect data from communities. We collect their stories. We collect their data. It is very important for people to come to develop, the will to come up to you voluntarily and tell you, I want to tell my story. I want it to be heard. I want it to be counted. Because people are usually very, very scared when they are intervened by police, or when they are, they are fabricated a case or whatever. So we do that. We gather data from the community. We have evidencialaviolencia.org. That's our platform of documentation. And we also gather data through litigation, like the case that we have to sue the government, the police actually, to get the use of force data reports that they make every time they use force against citizens. We won that case in the Supreme Court in coalition with our allies, where the attorneys from a clinic of the law school clinic, and they have a clinic on access to information. They are specialized in that, and our case got to the Supreme Court, and we won. And that's when the police had to start handing in thousands and thousands and thousands of use of force reports to our organization. And we created a precedent, in the Supreme Court. That's where the data analysis group arrived. My friend Tarak here is from the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, and they are here in the Bay Area. They are data scientists, and they helped us. They gave us all the technical assistance in order to process those documents, because it's thousands of documents, to process them and to collect the data and to create a public database that people will be able to get to use for any purpose, for any investigation, or even if you were intervene, because we're creating a roster of policemen, of officers. So if you were intervene and you think that there was excessive force used against you, you will be able to look in that roster. It is not public yet, but we have already a beta form of the database in our organization. So we also keep track of how many people the police kills. From not knowing anything, we have come to document 93 deaths by police intervention since 2014. And it could be more, but those are the ones we have been able to document with different sources. This is our database. I think I spoke about the non-counting state, and I meant that, for example, this is the gray bar is what the police reports as people that have been killed by them. And the yellow bar is what we report, what we have been able to document that are police killings. And it is, in average, 66% more than what they report. And they report it because we make them report it, because otherwise they wouldn't report it. They wouldn't report anything. Here's the HR DAG. We are doing, besides giving us technical assistance, they are now doing an analysis with us that I hope will serve to demystify what consent decrees and police reforms have been doing. You know, these police reforms that the DOJ, the federal DOJ, has been promoting in different jurisdictions. Puerto Rico has been in a police reform for 10 years. So it is my intention. I hope that we're able to do that. Let's see if the data will help us, if the data will support what we want to do. But it is my intention to demystify these police reforms, because they are full of bureaucracy. They are $1 million that are spent in those reforms, and they don't really do much. They don't transform what is not willing to be transformed, in the case of Puerto Rico at least. So we also do organizing, community organizing. We do public safety alternatives, different workshops on alternatives to public safety. We just facilitate dialogue so that people really reflect on what it is that they need in order to feel safe in their communities. And we try to have that conversation in a human rights-based scenario, instead of recurring to these notions that the police is what is necessary to have public safety. It is not hard. People really realize that they do need good living conditions, that they need health, that they need just basic services, good jobs, that they need energy. Puerto Rico has a big problem with energy stability, so they need access to energy. Those are the things that are making us, that will make us safe, and not the police. We do community mediation, and we do, different spoken word storytelling workshops. This is some pictures of Dímelo Cantando is the last spoken word workshop where they can, create their own songs on their experiences with the police in public housing. We do storytelling with people, victims who have lost their loved ones to police interventions. We do different videos and civic media pieces where they can tell their stories. It's a very powerful exercise of solidarity and of an organization. And we do these campaigns, like what is it that you need to feel safe? We are constantly doing these campaigns on public safety without mentioning the police anywhere. We don't mention them. We don't put a picture of them or anything. We talk about public safety. We talk about basic needs. We also do feminist work. Agitar la imaginación hacia un futuro feminista sin castigos is the last one we did. It was a public dialogue that translates into agitating the imagination towards a feminist future without punishments in order to find alternatives to the criminal legal system being the only option in punishment against gender-based violence, crimes, etc. It was very powerful. This was very recent. I'm very happy about that. And we do public advocacy in general. We go to the legislature if we have to. We do narrative change, like this one in the Miami Herald. I love this one. It was about gender-based violence in the police. And we had a collaboration. We collaborated with the Miami Herald and Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico. And we do a lot of work on narrative change in communications. So that's more or less, in a nutshell, what we do.
Thank you, Madi. I'm going to take the prerogative as the person that invited you and organized this of asking the first question, but we're going to have time for other people to ask questions. And I want to start with what may seem like a simple question, but every time I go to Puerto Rico, the police are driving around with their sirens and their lights on all the time. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to ask about that. They do that, and they never turn them off, it seems. But, right, like even when they're not responding, they're just kind of like on, flashing.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. Could be.
I want to ask a more serious question, though, which is about the similarities and differences between the issues that you confront around police violence and impunity in Puerto Rico and what those of us that live in the United States deal with. Obviously, as you've described, Puerto Rico has a very different history with regard to the role police played in colonialism. That's different in many ways than the history of policing in the United States. And yet there are many similarities in terms of the relationship between racism, the relationship between the real estate industry with what we see here in the United States. So I guess my question is, thinking about much more recent history, a couple years ago, the Black Lives Matter movement, after George Floyd's murder, we saw arguably the largest civil rights uprising of any moment in American history. How much did that energy, did that openness to change and to police accountability reach Puerto Rico? How much space did it create for you, for your organization, for your allies? And has the window of opportunity closed in Puerto Rico as quickly as it closed in the United States?
I just saw, how are you? Our friends from Micelio Abolicionista, they do abolitionist work in Puerto Rico, so thank you for being here. I think you go to school here, right?
No, not here, but I live here now.
But in the Bay Area. Thank you. They are an organization we have collaborated with. So when the George Floyd assassination occurred in the United States, it did create some stir in Puerto Rico, not as great as it did in the United States and other places, but it was very meaningful for us and for activists in general. So it did create a lot of space for reflection within our organization, and I think that it has defined our future, what we have done ever since. We started to reflect a lot on defunding issues, on abolitionism, more than we did before. We were more into, accountability before what happened with George Floyd and with documenting. But ever since, I think it did create a lot of space for reflection among activists. We at Kilómetro Cero held different conversations with activists and communities because we didn't want to just go with the flow of what was happening in the US, because we realized that our reality was very different than it is in the United States. So we wanted to have like our own reflections and our own, like, check ourselves on our own realities. So we started having different dialogues among activists, and that changed our organization because we definitely committed to a more to learning the process of being an abolitionist, because I don't think that's one thing that you learn today and you're an abolitionist the other day, But we are committed to going through the process of being activists that will advocate for the abolition of prisons, of the police, but especially of the colonial capitalism and patriarchy that is the main reason, right, behind the situations that we face in prisons in the United States and with the police in the United States. I mean, it's not about closing prisons. It is about closing the extreme gaps that take certain people to prison, right? That's like the major inequalities, the racism that takes people to prison. That's what we want to end. So yes, that has been very, very impactful for us as advocates. Also, the differences in Puerto Rico are quite, for me, are very, the racial dynamics in Puerto Rico are very different than in the United States, I feel. Because in Puerto Rico, I feel like in the United States, people know that there is racism, and black communities identify themselves as black communities. In Puerto Rico, they have told us historically that we are a mix of different races. So it is harder for people to identify themselves as black communities, because you will ask people if they are black or what are they, and they will tell you, I am Puerto Rican. There is like a lot of so we for documentation purposes have had to deal with that situation. Now we have to ask them, how do you see yourself from 1 to 6, 6 being the darker skin? How do you see yourself? In what scale of tone do you see yourself? Instead of asking, what are you? Are you white? Are you black? Are you... So I think it's a different dynamic because people don't realize that there is racism and there is structural racism. We were the first ones that were surprised to see when we analyzed the killings of the police killings. We were the first ones who were surprised because we did think that it was more of a class issue than a racial issue. But that's because racism is very invisible in Puerto Rico. It's hard to grasp. Of course, activists have worked hard, to recognize, for people to recognize that there is systemic racism, but it's not as clear, I believe, as it is in the United States.
Thank you.
I have lots of other questions, but I want to make sure there's space for people in the audience. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll start here and then come to you, and we'll go from there.
Thanks for talking with us today. I was just wondering, with regard to the legal toolkit that Puerto has, is there any way to, like, I don't know, advocate on behalf of these people in the court system? Like you mentioned, the fact that there were cases that were being dismissed.
Suspended.
Is there any way to, like, file a class action lawsuit on behalf of these people?
That would be a good contribution from the Berkeley School of Law. It has been such a very complicated process. It's under, everything is under a federal judge. She's the one who makes the decisions on the public debt in Puerto Rico, but about everything. Like, for example, if you have a case that has been stayed, is how they call it, you can ask the judge to
Lift the stay?
Yeah, to lift the stay, but she's the one who decides. So there's not like a consistent form to do it, and most cases have stayed. Now that they have now this year, from this year on, I think from May on, now we are able to sue the at least policemen in their personal capacity, and the government in certain cases, with a top of $75,000. It's the maximum that you can ask for the government. That is in the state the state courts. In the federal court, you can ask for more money, but you couldn't bring lawsuits in the federal government either. They were stayed in both circuits. So now we're being able to sue the government again, and we have created, both Kilómetro Cero and ACLU of Puerto Rico have created small legal teams to bring certain cases that are very important. Like, for example, the killings of 4 minors last year was very, very dramatic in Puerto Rico. Minors are the group that are at greatest risk in Puerto Rico to be killed by the police. And we have been able to present 3 cases in court this year. One is the Chanel case, and 2 others that are from 2 minors who were killed by the police, and they were unarmed. But it's hard, because first, for so many years, these cases were stayed that private lawyers stopped bringing those cases, working on those cases, because they wouldn't be able to get any money out of it. And they are very expensive. You know how expensive these cases are. You need, like technical, ¿cómo se dice? Peritos,
Experts, witnesses.
and you need money for these cases. So it's been very hard. But at least these 3 cases were presented this year, and we were able to create a legal group, a legal team made up of ACLU. There's only one lawyer in ACLU. It's the legal director, that's it, and some other private lawyers. But we are open to your collaboration if you want to think about this. We will happily do that. That could be a good idea.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I am a very proud producto UPR.
Hey!
Yeah, and actually one of the students that was targeted by the Department of Justice by Uso Estudiantil when I was.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh,
so
wow.
Very sad. I have so many questions, but I'll leave it to one. I'm very interested in your on-the-ground work when you do these types of organizing events, particularly with young people. How I think of it as education as a method of decolonization.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be as cynical and optimistic as you want, but what have you seen on the ground in terms of younger generations, especially those who are really against?
We are super hopeful. At least we have a group of Black adolescents, teens, that are from Manuela Pérez. You know, el Residencial Manuela Pérez. We've been working with them for several years now. And we have seen their transformation. And it's mind-blowing, mind-blowing in both, not only politically, but also with their perspective on the police. We thought in the beginning it was very hard because it was such a difficult subject to talk about in the public housing, where there are these dynamics, very violent dynamics with the drug dealers and the police. And the police is very violent there, but they also retaliate, especially the municipal police of San Juan. So it was difficult to make denounces, to denounce this police violence within the public housing, because we were going to put them in risk, both because of the police coming back to retaliate and because the groups that sell drugs in El Residencial also don't want you to be denouncing the police because it brings more attention and whatever. So we thought it was going to be very challenging, but what we did was, we are not going to talk about the police here. We're just going to talk about safety and about what we need to create leaders and what we need to. And we started, that's why when we came up with the spoken word workshops and the workshops on community mediation, and these kids have flourished, and some of them are now openly, for example, openly transitioning to another gender, and that is it's a very liberating act. If you think of that context where there is so much toxic masculinity in that environment. And so what we're seeing is, hopefully, what we want is for them to just be leaders. And we think that if they become leaders, they will fight the police, they will fight power, they will fight patriarchy, which is what we want ultimately. I don't care if they talk or not about the police, which is our main purpose in our organization, but we don't have to do that. You just have to fight power. We fight power by fighting the police. We fight patriarchy by fighting the police. The police is the most toxic, masculine institution of our society, probably. So that's what we're interested in. And at least the problem is that they are very few. This is like 12 kids, 12 teenagers. It's a big change, I think, for their environment. But what about the whole country? We want to have a bigger scale, because these workshops, 15 people will show up to your workshop. And that's great, but we want to be even more, impact more people. But it's not, it's hard. It's hard to do that. So you just have to como apostar, right? Apostar a lo pequeño y apostar al trabajo de esos 12 muchachas y muchachos, apostar a eso y seguir haciendo nuestro trabajo como podemos.
You have to bet on the little guy. You have to bet on that group of 12 students and keep doing our work. Other questions or comments? I have another one for you, Mari, which is, was there a hand up? I didn't. Mari, you and I have met at conferences and in communities all across the United States. We spoke last week or earlier this week, I forget, both of us at a conference in Los Angeles. We met in Tennessee and New York at conferences of people doing work in this space. How much of your work is dependent on or connected to the United States? And how do you think about the tensions or contradictions as a Puerto Rican doing anti-patriarchal, anti-colonial work in Puerto Rico, and also having so much of the funding for your work and the support from groups like HRDAG and beyond be based in the United States?
That's an important question. I definitely have that. In the beginning, it was really hard for me sometimes to speak about colonialism in the U.S. because I didn't want to hurt my friends. they were,
We have thick skin. Sorry.
you know, they were people that were also fighting in the U.S., but I didn't want to. It was hard in the beginning, but then I learned to do it, and because if you don't do it, they won't listen. You know, they will keep talking about their things, and they will not talk about Puerto Rico. So, but yes, I have learned. I am very grateful because I think that even though the United States is the biggest empire, the you know, it's the most capitalist and imperial country probably in the world, and I've been a victim of that because of our colonial situation in Puerto Rico. However, I see also that the civic core in the United States communities are very, very, you know, advanced in their struggles, especially in this subject, at least in the issues of police violence, of police accountability, of abolition, of defunding. And so I have learned a lot of this job from my comrades here in the United States. So I'm very grateful for that. And of course, not all of our resources, but most of our resources also come from United States philanthropy. So that is a contradiction, but I am, for example, I am also a founder and member of a big network of organizations that do the same, but are from Latin America mostly. And I also travel to Bogota with them, and I also hold conferences with them over there in Latin America. However, whenever they want to submit a proposal for the European Union or for foundations in Germany, they're mostly European foundations that fund people in Colombia, organizations in Chile, in Peru, in Argentina. When we do that, or even in the United Nations, I always have to sign a paper saying that Puerto Rico will not take a single dollar from that proposal because they will not fund anyone from the United States, and we are considered a jurisdiction of the United States. So it is, I have no other choice but to get money from the United States, which I think it's their responsibility because we are not part of the United States. We are a possession of the United States. It's not that I say that. The Supreme Court of the United States has said that repeatedly. That is the official story. We are not part. We are a possession. So as a possession, I just try to, I think that until we become a free country, they have to hold some responsibility over us. So I don't mind asking for the American philanthropy to pay for our for our work. That's
Yes.
what I do.
There's a question.
But it is a contradiction.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that last point. I don't think it's a contradiction not to invalidate your conflict. I think it's just a fraction of the reparations that were owed. And everyone that grows up in this empire, even people that are marginalized themselves, at least indirectly benefit from owning possessions, right? From the occupation and the looting of all these other nations around the globe. So the fact that a lot of people do this work and that get, you know, progressive points for doing it. And in our case, it's just life-saving work. And the fact that we don't have our own resources to do this work on our own is directly due to colonialism. So it's just reparations. And in fact, people here should be, if they consider themselves pro-liberation of land, of peoples, if they feel called to address historical inequities that they have directly or indirectly benefited from, then they should be running to us to offer resources and to distribute that wealth in whatever way it looks and is available to them. And they should take it up at their own cost too in any space that they enter. Because just looking at the distribution in this room, in this school, you can tell, right, how exclusive these institutions are and how many doors are open for a lot of people that will never be open for us. So I think this is also just an opportunity for everyone to add this to the list of things that they can think about, research more deeply on, visualize the connections amongst territories, because this is not, you know, just a Puerto Rican situation. So yeah, I think it's just a fraction of what we're owed in conclusion, and I don't think that you should feel any guilt about it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions, if people have other thoughts or comments.
I have a very general question. Gracias, Mari. And it's very simple, but I hope that it's useful. What do you need from us? Like, what does your organization need from us besides all the help that you're going to get from the law students at Berkeley, right? To home clinics and help us in this important work. But what kind of support can people, not only in the island, right, offer to your important work, but those of us in the diaspora, right? How can we contribute besides promoting what you're doing, sharing, et cetera? Or what concrete steps for those? And I'm not here to give you an assignment, but maybe you already have. Okay, we have groups working on these things, and maybe you can share those with us.
I think it's very, and this is, it's important for us to have support in the diaspora. I have tried to do that in New York at least. It was, because of the pandemic, it was kind of stalled for some time, but I think it's important because there are more Puerto Ricans, as I told you, outside of the archipelago than inside. So we definitely need that support, not only economic support or to find other venues of economic support, because this is year by year. I have money for this year. I don't know what's going to happen next year. That's one thing. But also definitely spreading the word about the work that we do and about these big issues that are mostly, when we fight police power, as I said, we're fighting colonialism, we're fighting patriarchy, and we're fighting colonial capitalism. We're fighting power and how power is interpreted in Puerto Rico or how it is exhibited in Puerto Rico. So that's mainly our work, and I think that it's important for our decolonization. And it's important also to have progressive people in the United States understand that, because sometimes they're our worst enemies in some cases, because progressive people will tell you, oh, we want Puerto Rico to be a state. We need to give them American full citizenship, first-class citizenship, and they don't realize that is a racist mindset, because you're believing that being American is a supremacy, is supreme. It's better than having a Puerto Rican citizenship. No, let's give them the best citizenship. What is that? The American citizenship? No, what we need is support for our local human rights defenders to really, first of all, define what the agenda will be. And when I say local, I don't mean like people from the island. It means also the diaspora. But what I mean is we need support to have an autodetermination process, a real decolonization process. We don't need to be, saved by American progressives by giving us a citizenship that most of us, it's not what we want either. Some Puerto Ricans want that, but they don't want it because they feel Americans. They want it because they want to be a state for economical purposes, because it's common sense. It's like, do you want to live like, that's what they tell you in Puerto Rico, you want to live like in Cuba or like in the United States? Of course. People will tell you, I want to live like in the United States, but it's a statehood that it's a white statehood, what they are thinking of. They are not thinking of a black statehood. They are not aware, most of them, or they don't want to be aware about the racial disparities that you live here in the United States. It's a white statehood, what they want. And a rich statehood, and not everybody is rich in the United States, as we know. So it's really also it's also out of clientelism. Like, it has been so. People will tell you they are pro-statehood not because they really believe in that, but because they depend on that, because they depend on the government, on doing a campaign, a political campaign, to get a teacher appointment. For example, to get a job, a real job, or like a regular job. So it has been very, very penetrated by clientelism and just low politics for a long time. So we don't need that kind of support. We need to spread the word and to support, like she said, people that are doing the groundwork and defenders that are doing the groundwork and that can, use those resources to claim for a real process, an internationally abiding process, not a process made in the Congress, not a process made up by the Democratic Party.
Please join me in thanking Mari.